to allow more participants to come in, but I wanted to thank you all for coming and being a part of this conversation. We're extremely excited and just happy to be here. So give us about 3 more minutes and then we'll go ahead and begin. Thank you. Mustafa, you still here? I think you stepped out for a moment.
No, I'm here. I'm right here.
Cool beans, cool beans.
I accidentally pressed mute because I was back here talking, so I'm here.
Got you. I can't see you on the screen, but I wanted to make sure you were here before we did introductions.
Okay.
All right. Hey, Gia girl. I see some very familiar faces and I'm super excited. Thank you guys for joining us.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Hey, mommy.
Hello, how are you doing, Jennifer?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Hi, Jen.
Hey, hey, hey. Got you. Hey, hey, hey. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. First and foremost, welcome, welcome, welcome to the Grief and Loss, exploring the varying facets of grief in the midst of COVID-19. So there's a lot of stuff happening in the world today, aside from COVID, but when we add COVID in the mix, it just brings the demeanor down, it brings a lot of people down. So I'm trying to figure out innovative ways to engage our people and engage our community and to address what is needed. And so I'm super thankful for the executive director of the Positive Results Corporation, Ms. Candy Lewis, for allowing me this opportunity and giving me this platform. I thank the PRC team for being supportive and helpful, Kelly, Gia, Crystal. And I'm just excited to bring this information and to share what we've been preparing. So the first thing that I would like to go over are the objectives, what we're going to be covering today. which is defining grief. There are different facets of grief. There are different brackets and different levels of grief. So defining what it is, and then also defining what it is for you personally. Describing expressions of grief, so what that may look like for some people, and understanding that everybody's grief is different. Describing the overarching process of grief and loss, going through the 5 stages of grief, and then how the process varies for men and women. Culturally, for the African American population, oftentimes we hear about the stigmas related to African American men and expressing themselves emotionally. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we come together and truly explain what that looks like? And then trauma related to grief. Sometimes we have these triggers in our lives which will cause us to go into deep depressions and will cause trauma. So exploring what that looks like, especially related to the aspects of grief. For a disclosure, this conversation may be triggering, so we completely understand if you have to leave the conversation and come back, get some water, do some coping mechanisms, doing some relaxation techniques. Breathing, for example, is extremely helpful. We ask that if you are not speaking, if you're not asking a question, that you keep yourself on mute. That will allow the speakers to be able to hear what's being discussed and also answer questions of those who have questions. If you need to speak with someone after this conversation, please feel free to reach out to info@prc123.org. And we also have resources that are easily accessible during COVID-19 times, which is via Zoom. So just like you registered for this conversation, you can also register to receive support for grief and loss as well. And then they also have phone numbers for you guys to access. The last thing that I did not include on the slide, but I am going to say, if you all have questions, there is a chat box at the bottom of your screen. You guys can type those questions in, or you can raise your hand, which is also on the chat box. If you're not familiar with Zoom, it's completely fine. I will ask in the presentation if there are any questions, and you guys can feel free to unmute your mics and ask the questions. Lastly, we are going to be recording this conversation. So this conversation will be recorded via live, and it will be posted on Facebook, but it's also on Facebook Live. So if you guys have any points that you liked or wanted to address, you guys can come back to the conversation and reach out if you need to. So on to our guest speakers. Our first guest speaker is a phenomenal bivocational leader and founding pastor of Word of Encouragement Community Church here in Los Angeles, California. In addition to her duties as pastor, she also holds the position of program manager for USC's Cecil Murray Center of Community Engagement. She is a motivational speaker, a trainer, author, radio personnel, community activist, just to name a few. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Najuma Pollard Smith. Dr. Smith, do you have anything you want to say at this time? She's currently on mute. So what we'll do is we'll come back to her. The next speaker we have is a dynamic brother who is always ready, willing, and able to share his humble beginnings. Being raised in a home where toxic masculinity was very prominent, he was able to be and beat the stigma related to African American men in society today. Not only is he talking the talk, but he has walked the walk and has learned from his past experiences. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Mustafa Jabril. Mustafa.
Hi, how was everybody? I think I just want to say I give my heart and my mind to the family of the brother that was, recently murdered by the police. I think the world is feeling that. So, and I also want to give, my heart out to all of us that has experienced, grief and loss.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thirdly, we have an amazingly talented young woman who serves as a role model, a pillar for her community, and strives to empower the young women and the troubled youth to restore their lives. founder of the Junior House Youth Foundation. She is determined to make a difference after losing her brother and son to street violence. She is actively on a mission to save the youth and give back to the streets that have taken so much from her. Please help me in welcoming Miss April Dean. Miss April, are you here with us today? You're on mute. Okay, go ahead.
I'm here. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Striving,
Good.
trying to pull through.
All right. I completely understand that. Thank you so much for being with us today. And lastly, we have a kind-hearted, uplifting young man whose intelligence knows no bounds. As a trauma psychologist and the co-founder of the Institute of Behavioral Health and Wellness, he allows clients to dissect trauma and gain a whole new perspective. Traveling to the Caribbean, Central America, North America, South, East, and West Africa, this dedicated individual is committed to unpacking trauma and assisting and supporting those who are survivors, but also who are flourishing and thriving. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Williamson. Dr. Rick?
Yes,
How
glad
are
to be. I'm good. Glad to
Good.
be here with everybody. It's a blessing for me to be here.
Likewise.
We're
Thank
in
you
some
so
interesting
much.
times.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I am your host, Jennifer Smith. Been born and raised here, and I'm excited to be a part of the PRC team, and I'm excited to embark on new journeys. I'm excited to see what PRC can become, and working with partners such as the individuals that I just spoke on, to engage in efforts to make this world a better place, to make sure that we all are in a place of peace and prosperity. So as we move on, I found this and it really stuck out to me. It says, grief is like an ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm and sometimes it's overwhelming. All we can do is learn how to swim. And so that kind of speaks volumes to not only the definition of grief, but how the process of grief is kind of like a roller coaster. And we'll be going through that later on in the presentation. So to briefly share what grief is, it's a natural physical or emotional response to loss. It is emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away in a sense. So whether it be death, whether it be the loss of a relationship, those types of things. The more significant the loss, the more intense the grief will be. You may be associating grief with death of a loved one, which is often the case. But the most intense type of grief is typically the death of a loved one. Even though it might feel overwhelming or awful, grief is a normal, healthy healing process. So at one time or another, we're all going to have to grieve something, and it is completely normal and it's completely healthy. And one thing I know that the panel wants to express is validating those emotions that you feel. Oftentimes we forget that no grief is the same. So validating those emotions for sure. So expressions of grief, and the guest speakers can chime in at any point in time. Expressions of grief, everyone has grieved differently. I like to think of grief as like a fingerprint because everybody's fingerprint is different. Some of them could be the same, a little, like they can be similar, but no fingerprint is the same. And it's kind of like grief. No one's grief is the same as someone else's. So as we process, as we're learning, as we're growing, understanding that everybody expresses their grief differently. Does anyone want to chime in about this?
I'll chime in.
Yes, ma'am, Miss April.
Expressions of grief. I feel like it's just so many, and you can't pinpoint on one, definitely one expression of grief. But I do know that within the community, I think that at least with African Americans, it's hard for them to express because I'm not going to say we just see so much, everybody sees a lot, but I feel as though we do experience more because of what goes on in our community and just things like that, what's going on in the world right now, you know. So the expressions of grief are just so, you know, they're all over the world. And I think it affects everything and every, you know, one differently, like you said, but I believe it affects women different. I believe it affects children different. I believe it, you know, it affects men different. It's just so hard to, you know, as a whole put together and say, oh, it's this, this, and this, and this.
Right.
The thing about expressions, I think there ought to be a lot of things shown and shared with people when you learn how to deal with expressions of grief.
Absolutely.
You know, because I know for me and my age group, you know, they have a lot of, you know, difficulties saying like, oh, I need help. You know, first of all, someone just saying I need help or I need someone to help me through this. It's really difficult for people to say that. And I've learned that just from my own experience and things that I've gone through. And also our community as African Americans, they have a problem with therapy. And I just don't, you know, I can't get past that. And I'm always telling someone like, you know, maybe you need to see somebody, maybe you need to talk to someone. And it's the number one thing that they're against.
Absolutely.
When I've found it to be the number one thing that helped me through.
Yeah.
Aside from that, you know, but yes, it like without it, I don't think I would have gotten to this point, you know, with all that I have experienced. So that's, you know, one of the things I just, you know, really want to get out there is just that it's okay to say you need help. It's okay to say that you need somebody or, you know, you need to speak to someone or you just, you know, need that special person to tell them something or express what you need to express about grief to them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I often think that grief brings a level of vulnerability that can't be avoided. It's hard for a lot of people to say, I need help. But I think grief brings you to a point of saying, okay, I can no longer hide this, or I can no longer just push it to the back of my mind. I must receive help for what I'm going through. And then once again, validating those feelings of it's okay to need help. It's okay to be in a vulnerable situation where you can't do anything but express what you're going through. So thank you for sharing that, Miss April. It's much appreciated.
You're welcome.
So the losses that lead to grief, as I stated before, oftentimes we associate grief strictly with death, but there are other forms of grief, such as material goods, so losing a house or a car, savings, memorabilia, physical grief for those who have to get things amputated due to health challenges, relational grief, such as spousal separation, sharing children or not having that close-knit relationship with children, parents, or even friends, vocational grief. So in the midst of COVID-19, we see a lot of individuals who have struck to a point where they don't have a job or they've been demoted, so they're not making as much money as they were. Spiritual grief. I've heard a lot of people talk about them losing faith in what they believe in, or losing that hope, or losing trust in what's going on. And so how do we get them back to a point of getting back to themselves spiritually? And lastly, we have the special grief, which is homicide, suicide, dementia for those who are losing their mental capacity, abortion, mental illnesses where our loved ones may go MIA for a certain amount, for an elongated period of time, or even rape. So just keeping that in mind, that grief definitely has a lot to do with death, but it also has a lot to do with losing something that's extremely close to you. So here we have this grief ball. It's called the Tangled Ball of Emotions. And so going back to grief being like the ocean, it's like a roller coaster. 1 minute you're happy, 1 minute you're sad, 1 minute you're frustrated, you're angry, feeling guilty, rejected. And it's hard in the moment to discuss how you really feel, especially when you're going through such an array of emotions. So definitely keeping that in mind for those of you who have loved ones, or for yourself, who are currently going through whatever grief you're feeling. Be patient with yourself. Give yourself time, because this is definitely something that you have to adjust to. You're now adjusting to a new normal because you're operating without these things that you used to have. So, textbook grief versus actual grief. So, it gives you the stages of grief on a slope. And so, on this slope, it's very black and white. It's just up and down. It tells you what you're going to be feeling: anger, fear, searching, disorganization, panic. And then on the right, you have the stages of grief. So, I definitely will disclose that my stages of grief totally look like this slope with a lot of stuff going on inside. Um,
Right.
and when you think about it, it's like you go from one extreme to the next. How do you process all of this going through your mind, being able to function on a regular basis? It's a lot. It is truly a lot. So, as I stated, just being really patient with yourself, because it's an adjustment. You're trying to make sure that you're balancing everything, that you're not necessarily keeping the past in the past, but you're remembering the good times, and you're not focused on the bad times, but you're also trying to press forward and do what needs to be done. So, as I stated before, there are 5 stages of grief that have been outlined. But as the guest speakers and I spoke, we are all aware that those 5 stages are really 5 times 25 when you think about it. Because, yes, we can try and crunch all of the emotions we feel into these 5 stages, but really and truly, it's not feasible, it's not workable, and it's really not, it's mentally, it's not tangible. Like, you can't really gather everything in 5 stages when you're feeling something completely different that may not even be described under these brackets. So the first stage is denial, where you're avoiding, you're confused, you're shocked, you're scared. Then you have anger, where you're just frustrated and you're irritated and you have this high level of anxiety. Then we go through the bargaining stage. You're overwhelmed, you're feeling helpless, you have a lot of hostility, and you're just not interested. Then we go to depression. We're struggling to find meaning. We're reaching out to others and telling our story, but we're looking for something, and that something that we're looking for we can't find, or it's not there. The last thing would be acceptance. So exploring options and new plans and moving on. But once again, these are not something that you go in order of. So you could be at acceptance at first, and then all of a sudden be angry, and then go to depression and bargaining and denial. So just keeping that in mind, that these are not fluid stages where it's just, okay, I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's definitely something that could change at any point in time. So with that, and keeping that in mind, and as we talked about the objectives, wanting to gain a better understanding of how men and women grieve, Mustafa has so graciously offered to talk about the toxic masculinity when it comes to grief, and also adding other elements to explore. Mustafa?
Hey, how's everybody doing? I think I really want to kind of, I know I only have 10 minutes and I wrote a book over here, but I just kind of want to talk about toxic masculinity and what it means, the definition. So it says in Wikipedia, is use academic and media discussions of toxic masculinity to refer certain cultural norms that are associated with harm in society and to the men themselves. So we as men actually harm ourselves unconsciously with some of the stereotypes that we have to live up to. Traditional stereotypes of men, socially dominant, along with related traits such as misogyny and homophobia, can be considered toxic due to the part and the promotion of violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence. So, like I said, I wrote a book, so I gotta kind of figure it out a little bit. But some of the dominant narratives that we have dealing with toxic masculinity is men don't cry. I can't cry in front of you. Most of us won't cry, as men won't cry in front of our children, won't cry in front of our women, won't cry in front of our boys. Another one, boys will be boys. Don't cry like a girl. Crying like a baby. Don't cry over that girl. In some cases, don't cry over the word bitch. Excuse my language. I just want to be blunt. And sometimes in the gang culture, you'll hear snitch, coward, sissy, ban, which the word ban means in in that language, you a bitch ass nigga. Using violence for respect and having sex for fun and with multiple women. And being a man don't consist of these things in some cultures, in the male culture, some male cultures, not providing positive support to the family because they're not receiving positive support to give from their families. They're not receiving it from the families, so they can't give it to others. It's something that we learn. And I want to talk about the prison thing. If you guys kind of look at number 1 through 4, a lot of young men that I work with are very uncomfortable with grief. Socially constructed masculine ideals dictate how men should be. It causes them to be stoic. A stoic person is a person who can endure pain or hardship without showing their feelings or complaining. You don't know how to feel, and you just accept it. So, kind of an example that I want to give to that, me, myself, and other people that I know. For me, I would use religion sometime. Hey, alhamdulillah, Allah has will, Allah has spoken. Hey, I have to accept it. I don't know how to grieve. I don't know how to cry. I was taught not to cry. I was taught that men shouldn't cry. So that's my way of getting out of showing that I really care. Then sometimes you have the hood thing to where they'll say, well, shit, the nigga got caught slipping. That's what happens when you gangbang. I've heard it all. I've heard all these different things coming out of some of the youth that I work with. And the reason why I wanted to talk about the prison thing is because the prison thing is really big. A lot of our young men are going to jail and getting locked up for the way that they feel and the crimes that they commit because of how they feel and can't really express and show how they feel. You know, it causes them to go to when a young man goes through a tragic event. Most of the time, the young men, they deal with it with anger. A lot of them talk to me about anger. A lot of them talk to me about retaliation. A lot of them talk about domestic violence. They commit domestic violence, on their partners, which causes them to recidivize. This sends them either to juvenile hall, it sends them back to jail or back to prison. If you look at the toxic masculinity within the suicide rates, one of the things that I've found out is that working with these young people is that they're afraid. Once, of course, they don't have anybody to talk to, like April kind of spoke about, not having somebody to talk to emotionally, not having a therapist, or if we get a therapist and that therapist just don't relate to us, right? So how do we talk to somebody that can't relate to us? And then now we're starting to have more African-American therapists. Even for me, myself, I had 3 therapists and all of them were Caucasian, and we couldn't connect because they couldn't understand my trauma and my pain. So this causes a lot of different things to happen. Of course, the mental illness stuff, the emptiness, which is the quality of lacking meaning or sincerity, meaningless. You become depressed, sad, lonely, bored. And one of the examples that I got out of that is a lot of the young men that I work with, they hang in the hood all day. They lose their purpose. They lose their purpose. They lose their spiritual intelligence. A lot of them don't have emotional control. Emotional control, intelligence, and intellectual intelligence goes together. So they lose who they really are and they just act out and they don't have anybody to talk to. So the prison thing, them thinking about getting raped. If you look at, you see it on TV a lot. It's backed up and kind of displayed on TV using sexual jokes. You have a lot of comedies like Friday, for instance. Next Friday, you had Day Day and Cube, having dreams about washing Damon's underwear and being his woman. Even when he returned from home, they still had that fear that he would sodomize them. A lot of the young men, like some of the times when I go to juvenile camps, a lot of them have been touched because that's what they get. They get that if you're a tough man and you're not feminine, in order to be disciplined, you have to be raped. And that's not what it is, right? So a lot of our youth will commit suicide because they don't want to have to go through this stuff. You know, you look at Baby Boy, you had Melvin telling Jody, if we were in prison, I will make you get on your knees and fix it. Mm-hmm. The reason why I'm talking about youth, because, and I know we're supposed to be talking about COVID, but a lot of our youth have fathers that are not around. A lot of these men have been, it's been a generational trickle down for men to be tough. A lot of times in the gang culture, if you don't go to prison, you're not even considered trusted. So once you get to prison, you have to live this way. You have to be tough. You have to, if you get involved in certain things and they decide to rape somebody, you're involved. Whether you do the actual rape or you hold them down, you're still involved. So our young men are becoming like their fathers, their grandfathers, and great-great-grandfathers, and our young men are going to have babies. So in a nutshell, these are our kids and these are our future generation. And this is what's going to happen if we don't get a hold to them, you know? So I just want to end with that. I have a lot more to talk about, but I only have 10 minutes, so I'm just going to stop. Because I can go on and on with this stuff ever.
Right, absolutely. And I think you brought up a good point in relation to young people going to prison or young men going to prison, and how that transition from prison back to home, or even home to prison and back home, that could be in and of itself a grieving process. And I would love for Dr. Pollard Smith or Dr. Williamson to chime in on this as well, because it's a transition that's not easy. And I've heard a lot of people talk about, especially in the forum that we had last week, where people are transitioning from home to prison, and this COVID-19, us being quarantined, for them, it's like being on lockdown. And so for them, this is an understanding of, oh, okay, well, you know, this is just like when I was inside, as opposed to this is new for us. We're not used to being so just stuck in the house and in the house board, so to speak. So if anyone would like to chime in on that.
Yeah, I want to say at this, Jennifer, and thank you, Mustafa, for being so blunt and clear. And I'll say this in relationship to this conversation, in relation to COVID. I think part of why you even have a segment of the community that's not moved by this COVID-19 virus is because when you've survived so much trauma, something that looks like the flu, sounds like the flu, is not so scary. You know, there's some people that have lived through so much trauma that you tell me about a possible disease that I may get. Do you know what I just went through? You know, do you know what I've survived? I've actually had people say that, like,
yeah,
listen, you know, like, this is nothing compared to the trauma I've survived, I've lived through. So I think it is definitely related to the COVID-19, in that while we're expecting everyone to respond to, you know, to the shutdown orders or to the mask orders, there are people that have just survived so much horror that one cold or something that looks like a cold is of no threat to them. And even if you bring up statistics around the death toll, for some, that's a welcome invitation. Like, okay, because I've been through so much. And so I think that's also something that we have to take into account when we talk about Black and Brown communities, is the trauma has been so extensive and so real that sometimes it can even cloud our ability to respond to these kinds of situations in a way that's wise or reasonable, because the trauma's been so real and the trauma's been so great, and I have yet to get proper care, whether that was transitioning in or transitioning out or both. And so you're expecting me to be afraid of a disease, but I've actually had men put their private parts in my mouth, or, you know, in my rear end, or whatever, or I've been touched, or whatever the case has been. And so I think that's even we think about this shutdown process, you know, we have to consider that there are people that that have faced and are facing other really significant traumas to their mind, body, soul, and their emotions and their psychology, that that we can't expect people to respond to even this COVID shutdown, lockdown, whatever you want to call it, in a way that everybody else is responding to it. So I just wanted to add that. But a lot of times, you talk about transition. In the transition, people are just expected to, especially people of color, are expected to just get along, figure it out, go home, come back in, whatever, go back and forth, and just, figure it out. And that's an unfair and unjust expectation.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Rick Williams.
Yes, yes. So, yeah, I would just add to Dr.
Hi.
Smith. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think one of the things that we also we do well to also keep in mind, the level of impact of trauma can be so great, and obviously incarceration situations are one of those places where we know that we will see lots of trauma. And if you don't have trauma going into a situation like a prison or a jail term, there's a good chance coming out of it you've definitely experienced the trauma. And a lot of times we are trained to look for things like suicidality, and we may miss the fact that what can happen for communities is, instead of sort of an active suicidality, which we're trained to look for, what we start to see is a different type of suicidality at the most extreme end, where people basically start to take risk and just don't take the safety precautions. And in some ways they sort of skirt, that fine line, and in some ways sort of welcome death in some ways, but it's not an active engagement of death. In other words, they're not loading a gun and putting the barrel in their mouth and pulling the trigger, but they will put themselves in harm's way. And we don't necessarily think about that as a type of pull towards suicidality, a pull towards death in your own demise. But absolutely, it can be one of those symptoms that are there as a result of a trauma process, or depression as a result of a trauma process that's very extreme. And I think we do see this in communities, but we've never really looked at it and called it for what it is.
Right. Absolutely.
Can I speak on that? Can I respond to that? He's absolutely correct about that. A lot of the young men and women that I work with, a lot of times they will actually walk in the wrong community with their shirt off and have their community tattoos on their bodies, knowing that they're in the wrong community, and get killed or get shot. And when I would talk to them about it, so we come to realize that sometimes they do suicide by gang. They walk into a trap, or it's not even actually a trap. They're just walking into territory just to get killed. So
are there any questions so far? I'm sorry, Mustafa. I meant to put myself on mute while you were talking. Forgive me.
Oh, no problem. But yeah, for me myself, when I was into that street life, I remember going through gang wars, and I mean, I've seen people drop right next to me. Then here you go with the COVID-19 thing. That's like the common cold, me myself, I haven't been in a house since the COVID-19 thing has happened. I've been working. So it doesn't bother me, but I know it bothers other people. And then I have young people that I'm working with who's lost family dealing with COVID, and the first thing they do is go out there and do something to retaliate, and has nothing to do with COVID. They go out there and shoot somebody because their family, their uncle or their auntie died from COVID, and go and shoot somebody. So this is the way that they handle grief, through anger. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it causes them to lose it. But it causes them to lose their sincerity. A lot of them are sleeping with different women. A lot of them are lying to their parents. A lot of them are stealing from their parents or stealing from their friends. They just don't know how to cope, other than doing something that's going to most likely get them locked up, or maybe even hurt.
May I speak?
Absolutely, Ms. April.
Another thing that I see a lot, and I'm sure everyone knows someone that is in this position, that this grief brings on a lot of, like you guys are speaking of, self-destruction in so many other kind of ways, as far as like alcohol abuse and drugs.
Yes.
Yes, because I see people all the time just drinking, or either they're, taking drugs or doing something to basically what they know they shouldn't be doing to their body, that they're doing to their body, and they're going about it another way. They're going about it totally another way. Like drinking themselves to an oblivion. And it's like so crazy because you see what it is. And this goes back to another thing, like Dr. Najuma was saying. I feel as though the same way, like when this stuff came about and I knew what it was doing to people, I totally looked at it though, like she's saying, all what I've been through, this is a cakewalk. Like, I mean, this is a total cakewalk to me. From the trauma that I've experienced, just me, myself, and what my family has been through, and what, we're still going through, and we'll always be going through. It's a cakewalk. But self-destruction it's really something, just to see, your people and your loved ones and stuff just continually doing it to themselves. And then you speak about it and them, slowing down or, stopping what they're doing, and they don't feel as though, there's no reason to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when we discuss or when we think about self-destruction, we must consider triggers.
Yeah.
Because somewhere, some way, somehow, someone has been triggered, which will lead to this destructive behavior of drinking, smoking, promiscuity, things of that nature. So the next thing we're going to discuss, Dr. Pollard Smith will be discussing triggers for us.
Again, thank you everyone for inviting me to be a part of this important discussion. And so my assignment is to talk about triggers, and we're in a very difficult season right now. Like there's a lot happening in our nation and globally, and people are being triggered. And so we this word is used a lot, and sometimes it can be, used in a joking way, but it's very real. And sometimes you don't even know you're being triggered. Sometimes you don't even know that something has triggered you until you say something or do something, and someone has to bring it to your attention. So a trigger really is a reminder of a past trauma, and it can result in feeling like this, again, this overwhelming sadness, anxiety, and panic. It can come from, having a flashback, and a flashback is a vivid memory of something that may have, that comes out of nowhere. And the best way to describe a trigger is, everybody, if you think about your favorite song, and when that song comes on the radio, especially if you haven't heard it in several weeks, days, months, maybe even years, when that song comes on, it immediately takes you right back to a place, either the first time you heard it, or the first time you danced to it, or the first time you did whatever. And it takes you back to that place, and you relive the emotion, the feeling, and even for some, the vivid, the visual, and you relive that thing. And so that's what a trigger is. And so the season that we're in right now is so triggering. This COVID-19, I know for myself, and I've had to share this with people, that I can't watch the news, especially in the beginning when they were constantly sharing the death toll. I had to just not watch it. And even now, I just have really chosen to be very mindful of the things that I'm watching, because as one, my son was murdered, and even though he did not die from a disease, the conversation around death and the way that the news was reporting it over and over again kept sending me to a place where I was constantly going back to the day that my son died. And so a lot of times people are being triggered, and and what you might run into at the liquor store or at Starbucks or in line at the market is not a bad person. It's someone who's been triggered because they listened to the news one too many hours, or somebody said something or something happened, and they've been tapped. that place of pain and agony, especially if that individual or individuals have not gone through any kind of therapy or any kind of support group, or their community support has not been very strong. I was blessed to have very strong community support that I just could not even ever imagine. And that's one of the things that I've learned has been beneficial in assisting with those seasons of triggering is community. So what's so beautiful about this conversation that we're happening is that right now, the 60 plus people that are on this Zoom, plus those that are watching live on Facebook, we are a community, and and just by being here, we're supporting each other, because we don't know how someone right now is being triggered by the news of yet another Black man being killed, and the way in which he was killed, and just the conversation around brutality. Even the word brutality being used over and over again can be a trigger for someone who's been brutally taken advantage of, who's been abused, who's kind of gone through any kind of sexual violence or domestic violence or anything.
Absolutely.
And so so triggers can be words, triggers can be images, triggers can be a scene, watching a scene of some kind of pain. Even though it's not the same kind of pain, it can still trigger. And so one of the things that I lean into is really training and teach people about kindness, because you never know where a person's at. And though we cannot manage other people's triggers, we certainly can manage how we engage one another. And so that's what I wanted to kind of shift into. We can go to the next slide. Is is what happens to a person when they've been triggered. So there's this thing, and so even in grief, well, fight, flight, and freeze are not new to anybody. Whenever you feel attacked, this is like a common response that people will do one of three things. They'll either fight back, they'll take flight, or they'll freeze. And so part of what we see happening, even for example, in Minnesota, is people who are dealing with their grief and they're deciding to fight back. And they are saying things like, we're not taking it no more. We're not having it. And it might appear that their behavior is unruly and, oh God, how could they? But when that place of pain and grief has been tapped one too many times and then unresolved, you will do one of three things, and you'll fight. Then there are some people that take flight. They totally disengage. They just, they run the opposite way. They go the opposite direction. Another way to see this is people who go all the way to maybe fear, anxiety, where they totally close in. So even in the COVID pandemic, people who just like, I'm not touching anybody, I'm not going anywhere. They close their doors and they still got their doors closed. Or the flight might be an extreme positive, where you see people go like unusually happy, right? They get unusually positive in dark times or difficult seasons. And then the freeze is where someone just gets totally disassociates, where it's like, I don't see it, I don't feel it, it's not happening, it's not real, or become numb to a degree where it's happened so much. It's like, and that's part of one of the things that I encourage, especially those of us, people of color, is we can watch so many videos of our brothers and sisters being killed that actually seeing someone being killed no longer penetrates. No longer, we become numb to it to the extent that we don't even fight anymore. We don't even care about justice. It just happened, and it's kind of like the story of the Good Samaritan, the people that walked over the man first before somebody came along and helped him. That there were those that literally just walked over. You can just get to a point of freeze and numbness where you can just walk over a problem and not really care. And so when we're talking about grief in this COVID season, part of what we see people doing is either they're fighting back, and we could even, you know, as much as I'm not in agreement with it, but even those people that are saying we want our freedom back, you know, in Florida, we want our freedom back. We're tired of being locked up. I believe some of them are dealing with grief. And their only way to manage is to fight back and say, let me out the house, you know, lift the band. And some of it's political, but some of that is also them dealing with their own grief of being locked in the house or being shut down from life and not being able to cope and manage it, but also not having access to, or not maybe taking advantage of access to therapy or any kind of assistance. And then you have the flight and the freeze. And so as a people, we have to identify that within ourselves, but also give people grace when we see them either fight, flight, or freeze, and understand that that may be that's just their response to the grief. And so what we have to do is we have to work them, help them get to a place of some kind of healthy response or healthy movement through the process of grief. And what I also want to talk about, we can go to the next slide, is just some ways to manage triggers. And again, sometimes you can be triggered and not be aware of it until someone asks you a question like, what's going on? You know, what's wrong with you? And you're like, nothing's wrong with me. No, something's wrong because you're going off on everybody, or, you know, or just a total numbness, that shutdown. Sometimes you're not even aware. So there's just some things that I've leaned into, that I know others have leaned into, and the therapists that I've worked with have offered as ways to care for ourselves, but also offer to our community when we are being triggered, but also things we can offer to those when they're being triggered. And of course, personal self-management. You've got to do what works for you. I know for me, I had to lean heavy into comedy during this season, but also comedy, just leaning into comedic comedy and laughter helped me to meet a balance. So whatever your self-management needs, we want to encourage that. And but at the same time, you know, we also want to pay attention to, when we talk about self-management, we're not talking about self-medicating. There's a difference. Self-medicating is when I drink through my problem, or when I, you know, sleep through my problem because I'm taking too many sleeping pills, or you know, all the other ways. And so self-management is when there's an awareness of where I am, and then I'm doing the things I need to do to help me better manage that space so I can move into a healthier place. Self-medicating is where I'm trying to anesthetize or numb the pain. And so we want to pay attention to that. Doing things that are cathartic. Writing is cathartic. I know for me, when my son was killed, you know, posting on Facebook and Instagram was cathartic for me. And I was just doing what I needed to do to release the emotions and the feelings. But what ended up happening, my cathartic process ended up happening, helping other people. So I got dozens of messages daily from people that would say how this has helped them. Going through a process of self-awareness, and self-awareness is knowing who you are, where you are, you know, where, and being aware of your emotional state, your physical state, your health state, your spiritual state. And sometimes we need help with self-awareness. And so even allowing people that you trust to say to you in a loving way, hey, you're not resting, or you're agitated, and then allow, you know, just kind of working through some of that, reframing the circumstance or situation. And that this is difficult because life is what it is. And so when we talk about reframing, we're not talking about changing the stories that it mitigates the reality of your pain, but reframing circumstances or situations is being able to see it from a different perspective without negating the reality of the pain. Because I think that can happen sometimes. We're like, well, look on the bright side. Well, when someone's been killed around you, or when you've been sexually assaulted or abused in home, there is no bright side to the story. The story is what the story is, but there is also ways to tell the story or to live through the story where it's no longer just the pain, but it also becomes a place of power without negating the pain. and we don't want to move it. And that can happen in church sometimes, where we're encouraged to, thank God too soon for what happened. And we can do that, because we want people to feel better. But the challenge was that is that we can sometimes tell people, well, bless God because, well, hey, I can't bless God for that right now. But there is a way to look at things in a way in which I can see opportunity without negating the pain of my reality. Intercession, that's where people step in and allowing people to intercede on your behalf, whether that's through conversation, whether that's through prayer, worship, chanting. There are ways in which people can intercede. And one of the things that I talk about often is the community of people that loved on me so much. I had people just praying for me from all different kinds of faith groups, and that intercession, that coming in and really being there, are things that we can allow people to do. And what I want to offer to everyone that's on, those that are watching live on Facebook, is that if you are experiencing a trigger, if you're able to, give people permission to intercede on your behalf. And part of self-awareness is being able to say, listen, if you see me going down, I need you to do this for me. I need you to intercede in this way. Relaxing techniques. And there's a whole host of relaxing techniques, but I'm going to just talk about the one that I lean into, and that's meditation, breathing. Even though I've been doing meditation for a number of years, even before my son was murdered, but leaning into that heavily after that happened, and really going through the practice on a more consistent basis, and just learning to breathe and to relax my mind, relax my emotions, relax myself physically. There were times where I would just lock up. And I still do it, and I have to breathe and just allow myself to relax. Pastoral counseling, and I would not just say pastoral counseling. I'm going to say, any kind of faith counseling, because everybody's not in a church where they have a pastor, but any kind of faith group. And sometimes you may have to lean into counseling outside of your normal faith group because it's too close, and you might have to allow yourself or open yourself up to allowing others to speak into you, but that's something that you have to be comfortable with. And of course, therapeutic interventions. And one of my things that I share often at church is have a little talk with Jesus and a therapist. I believe in therapy, and I believe in it now more than ever, but I believe in therapy. And I think one of the things that could benefit our communities that are grieving and grieving for a number of different reasons, especially during this pandemic, is to lean into therapy.
Absolutely.
So thank you for allowing me to share that. And I guess we'll take questions or input, Jennifer.
Yes, ma'am. We do have a couple of questions. I just wanted to go back to the relaxation techniques. Oftentimes, we don't realize that we internalize grief, and our bodies tend to take another direction than our mental would. So oftentimes when we're going through the stages of grief and we're processing our grief mentally, we don't realize that there's a physical toll that's being taken on our body. And when you talked about being locked up or being clenched, oftentimes those who are going through grief don't realize that. So definitely taking a look at yourself, not only mentally, but physically, making sure that you look at all aspects of your life and making sure that you're taking care of everything when it comes to grief, because grief can sneak up on you. And like I said, it's a minute by minute for some people. 1 minute I'm so happy, I'm elated. The next minute I'm so ticked off and I don't know what to do with myself. So being mindful, I think mindfulness is extremely important, especially dealing with such a sensitive subject as grief. Miss Kelly has sent us some questions. The first thing is diving in work projects and just staying in activities. Is that a healthy coping skill? And anyone can chime into that.
I think the answer that I would offer is no. And let me talk about diving. When we talk about diving, I think doing things that help you to process is one thing, but diving, when we talk about diving, typically we're talking about allowing ourselves to be so distracted that we don't want to deal. That's actually no different than medicating with a drink. And so we have to be careful about, well, I don't want to deal with the pain, so let me just work. Because what ends up happening, I might spend 2 weeks working on a project just to avoid the pain or avoid the conversation. But when that project is over, the pain is still there. And so if I'm diving into work to avoid the pain or to anesthetize, no. If I'm working or a project or doing something that allows me to process through the pain, that's different. And so I think that's where we have to pay attention is, am I doing this to avoid, or am I doing this because it'll help me process?
I'm sorry, Dr. Williamson, do you have anything to add to that?
Absolutely. So, there's I can only add to it to just say there's constructive ways that we may grieve, and so the textbooks are gonna break it down textbook style, but I think here's where I think they do shed some interesting light on things. There's some grieving that is what we would just call sort of a direct intuitive type of grieving process where we're expressing those feelings and those emotions. But then there's also an instrumental type of grieving, which is still a part of grieving. And that's when it's not so much a direct expression of the emotion, but people do get active. They do get active. They do go into sort of a work type of an orientation, but it's not to disconnect from the grief process. It's work that might entail, well, then how do we then acknowledge our loved one? How do we then, make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else? Can we develop a scholarship in the name of my child? Can we actually develop a movement that could help this to not happen to anybody else? And there's nobody who's all one way versus the other. We're all sort of on a spectrum. Sometimes we have the direct expression. Sometimes we have more of that indirect expression when it comes to action. But absolutely, I would say, but we don't want to get into diving into work as a way of separating and disconnecting. I do know that sometimes we may be tempted to do that because the pain is just so great.
Yeah.
Any bit of relief can help, but we do have to be careful because when that pain gets great like that, if the go-to is, well, then I need to shut it off and dive into work, that becomes sort of a coping pattern that sort of keeps us locked in.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you both for that. The next question we have is, how can we start support groups, or are there any in our community? So I know for the end of this presentation, I do have a list of organizations that are providing support, especially during the COVID-19 timeframe. So they're providing that support online. So just as you registered for this workshop, they have you register in order to be a part. And I'm going to open it up to the guest speakers. You all can share the information you have in regards to support groups, or how to even start a support group.
I know, Jennifer, like for our church, we have a resident therapist who actually, and she'll be in June. We're going to be doing a support group weekly, a virtual support group at this point. And there are several churches that I know of that have. Some of them have ongoing, some of them have seasonal where they do, periodic, like they might go 6 weeks, take a break 6 weeks. And so I know there was a question about should there be a move? And I think there should be a move for more. There are communities, agencies, and churches that are doing, and faith groups, I'll say that way, that are doing support groups. And there are agencies that are doing support groups. Should there be a move for more? Absolutely. Because, and especially with this COVID-19 season, so many people have lost loved ones, and not being able to go to funerals, not being able to be there at that last breath. Those things really will manifest in the lives of people 6, 9, 12 months from now. We'll be 2021, and we're going to see people breaking down because somehow they got triggered that they didn't make it to grandma's funeral, or they had to watch the burial, on a Zoom call. And those things will manifest for people. So we certainly, and this is a great time to lean into, for those that have agencies and spiritual spaces, to start support groups, because right now we're in the thick of it, but it's the fallout that's gonna really hit our communities hard, and we're being set up for that as these things are playing out, and we really should be in a position to be spaces of healing in whatever way we can be.
Thank you so much for that. And I believe when we think about death, for the communities of color, we like to come together. It's often said that we typically have family reunions at death and at weddings, or at funerals or at weddings. And I'm curious to know how people are currently coping, because we don't have that option to touch, hug, feel one another, go through that energy, because oftentimes we feel off each other's energy. So I'm interested to know how people are coping at this particular point in time with losing a loved one. Like you said, not being able to experience that last breath. What does that look like? And oftentimes when we're processing grief, we like to process with other people. We like to process with family and friends, but we're not able to do that right now, due to our social distancing orders. But I thank you for sharing. We have one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to Dr. Williamson. The question is it better to get cultural specific therapy? So whoever would like to jump in and answer that.
I think it's good to get therapy that's going to educate you about yourself, about your problem, about your trauma, about what you're going through. And I also think that it's sometimes okay to get a therapist who culturally understands you. And I think it's also good to understand and know what your culture is. So when you say cultural therapy, I mean, I think they would have to be more in detail with that. But I think it's the thing is to become educated on your trauma and what you're going through, so you can basically grow within yourself at the end of the day.
And I think it's good to get cultural therapy, because from my own experience, of course, I think it helped me more by my therapist being more in sync with what's going on with the culture, but her being from the same culture. So I do think it's more beneficial than just being, tagged with the person to say, oh, because they're a therapist, this is what they do. But to find out some background on who you're getting therapy from, and, kind of where they're from and what they're about, and, what their foundation is before you, and they give you like little short bios and stuff on therapists before you, go into like hiring them for the job, you attending therapy with them. So I think it is beneficial. I've definitely seen, the difference, and it really was more beneficial in the end.
Absolutely. Thank you both, Mustafa and April. One thing that I do want to say, when you're looking for therapists, like you said, everybody's foundation is different. So some therapists are more culturally competent than others. Some of them have a broader perspective or can pull from different cultures, because they could be biracial. They could have the experience of having both cultures. They could have studied a specific culture. So definitely being mindful when you're searching for therapists, you want to make sure that they're culturally competent and they're culturally aware, which would give you a better idea of how things are going to work, how this working relationship will unfold. I definitely think it'll give it a better sense, and will eventually help you, because they'll give you an opportunity to see things from a broader perspective in the end.
Well, and one more thing, the reason why I say that is because when you're going to therapy, what you want most is to come out feeling as though, you know, you've had some relief about what's going on with you. So why I think it's more beneficial with the whole, you know, with cultural therapy is because when you're in therapy, you don't want to have to explain every single thing that you say. If it's, you know, like if you're using like a slang term for something, or you're referencing to something that only someone from your culture would know about, you
Right,
don't
right.
explain every time, you know, when you use a certain word, oh, well, you know, what does that mean? Or, you know, you want them to already know because it's an adjective while you're,
Mhm.
and you don't want that. So
Absolutely.
yeah, or you want it to run as smooth as possible and for it to be relieving as possible for you while you're in session. So I think that's, you know, one of the main benefits, like, for it to be cultural therapy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that insight from all of the guest speakers. We're actually going to transition to the trauma-related grief. And Dr. Williamson, after you go through these, I have a question from one of the people on the line. So after you go through trauma-related grief.
Absolutely. Sure. So I'd like to maybe start with an illustration. It's a real story, actually. It's from a colleague of mine. Um, and she had done some work with a group of ladies who all of them had lost a child to gun violence. And so they had formed a group in order to get active about addressing that issue. And my colleague had a chance to meet with them over a number of weeks. And one of the conversations was, she just asked, what then, when the grief is there and those emotions are really difficult, what do you find is most helpful? And of a group of 20, 25 women who all endured, sort of the most horrendous emotional experience, losing a child. Some of them said, I just need somebody to ring the doorbell, call the phone, get me on the phone, talk to me. Some of them said the exact opposite. I just need to be left alone, to just sort of sit and collect myself. And you had this range, and there was no consensus whatsoever, and trying to figure out what to do with that. My colleague says, so we've got all these different answers. What do we do with this? What does this mean? And the women actually came up with, well, what these different answers are really suggesting is we just want people in our lives who are willing to be sensitive to ask us what we may need. And if we need them at that time, they're responsive. If what we need at that time is to be left alone for a bit, they're responsive. People who are able to just be responsive in the moment, because the days are going to just it's going to leave you in different places. And I thought that was really, really astute, because what we've been talking about through the content here is we're talking about grief and loss, but we're also talking about how it doesn't seem to follow a predictable format or pattern. It's different for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really important thing to emphasize is, as I try to sort of talk about some things in maybe a structured way, just know that everybody's different, everybody's unique, but at the heart of it, do we have people around us? Do we have a way of maybe understanding our experiences that allows us to be where we are with it on a particular day? That's a really important piece, just to allow yourself to be where you are with it. Another piece from that illustration, though, that I do want to speak to, and this is a very practical piece. A lot of times we do recognize that a lot of our men are not necessarily willing to engage the expression of the grief. They're not willing to engage the therapeutic process even because of that. And as a therapist, working with a group of, many therapists, and we're all therapists of color, Black, Asian, Latino, Latinx. One of the things that we've realized is, hey, a lot of our men have an idea about, therapy, which means, okay, they're going to have to bring up some real tough feelings, and they don't know about what, they're not really comfortable with expressing that, because then those feelings bring emotions and tears. And for a lot of the experiences that I've had, I realize the calls that we get, and we are primarily men in my therapy group, primarily male therapists. A lot of the calls we get, they're not brothers picking up the phone calling. It's their mothers, it's their partners, it's their wives who see that they need to actually engage therapy, but they're not willing to do it. And so our 2 cents is, well, hey, mom, sister, whoever that woman is in that man's life, pick up the phone anyway. Set up a family therapy session. Let them know, hey, here's what we need. And if they can just get in the door and have an experience, it usually just takes 1 or 2 sessions before they realize whatever that idea is that keeps them from therapy, it demystifies that. They actually get a chance to sit in that space and realize that it's not, a bunch of overwhelming, scary emotions that come out that make them regret it. It's a relational experience. And once they have that taste, then they are willing to actually connect with themselves. So that's just a real practical piece that we've learned in our work. We will absolutely do a first or second session where we actually have the whole family there, with the intent of just letting some folks know, a lot of the men know that, hey, to sit in this space, it's okay. We know how to relate to that.
Absolutely.
So the third piece that I use from that illustration then, a lot of the grief, a lot of the bereavement process that we're actually talking about is not your straightforward grief and bereavement. There's actually a difference when it comes to bereavement and the grief process that'll play versus traumatic bereavement when there's been trauma. And so an example of a typical, or what's sort of being an expected bereavement process, even though it's still difficult, we all have maybe a script for what it means to lose a grandparent. At some point, we probably lose a grandparent. And even though that's difficult, and for some, it can still be traumatic, depending on how that's happened, depending on the nature of the relationship. But for many, okay, that happens, and we can move through that. We've got family, we've got ways of maybe dealing and coping and navigating that one. There is no script for losing a child. Nobody has that script. Nobody has a script for if you lose somebody unexpectedly, car accident, something that you just did not ever imagine. When you don't have a script for it, then it's very difficult to then integrate and then cope and deal and navigate through that process. So in the slides, I'm just really trying to bring out, there's a bereavement process that happens when we lose people, and we sort of have a frame for navigating that. But then what I think we're really talking about, though, is what happens when we don't have the frame for it, when we lose someone unexpected, when it's complicated for various reasons. And when you've got that, then there's a grief reaction, which is the reaction to the loss. But then there's a mourning process that has to happen. And so if the grief is the reaction, the mourning is, okay, how do you deal with it? That's when you intentionally start to engage a process by which you're now moving through. How do you then take that in and sort of redefine and understand that and make sense of it and move forward? That's that mourning process. And that needs to happen regardless of traumatic bereavement or just the bereavement that's expected. But when you've got traumatic bereavement, you've also got the trauma symptoms, because it's so unexpected. In those trauma symptoms, whether you have intrusive thoughts about sort of the last moments of your loved one, whether it's the avoidance because the pain is just too great, and so you have to shut that off and you can't engage that mourning process. Trauma symptoms interfere with the mourning process. So when you're trying to move through this thing, you've got trauma symptoms that will then put a block on it, and it sort of keeps us stuck. And so we never really move through it. And what we learn is that anytime those emotions come up, they're horrendous, they're scary, they're too overwhelming. And so we go for avoidance techniques in order to just live and do life, but we never process. And so that's the piece, if we're going to actually move through and deal with traumatic bereavement or complicated grief, because we're living in a COVID context where, for African Americans, the death rate is so much higher, 7 times higher than for Caucasians and others. But then you've got, the stuff that has always happened. Racism never took a break through the shut-in. and so we continue to see evidence of that. And when we've got all of these complicated factors, how do we then move through grief and mourning processes where we've got these other complicating factors that can actually be roadblocks that hang us up? And so it's a real challenge and a real trick to sort of do that. But this is where we come down to a few things that I hope can be helpful for us with this. When we're talking about, things like therapy is going to try to set a safe environment, number one, where the things that are very difficult to come up can actually be brought up and words can be put on it and that expression can happen. But therapy is also going to try to help people develop, some things that I think are just real good to keep in mind, because you don't have to be in therapy to sort of do this work and engage the process that's going to be constructive. When I talk about things like positive images and memories of your loved ones, understand that some people are left with the most horrific memories because they saw the mangled remains of a loved one, or they imagined the horrible last moments of their loved one. And as hard as they try, that's the only thing that sticks with them. And so we have to get active around, okay, but we've got to make room and space for what are some of those other memories? And you make the progress when you find that you can remember that deceased loved one in ways that are really accurate. It's not just that most extreme, painful, terrible stuff, but you also can remember the things that bring a smile to your face. Okay, you can remember all of that. That's when you're moving in that direction. But it takes work to actually cultivate that.
Absolutely.
The ability to feel like a good enough person. Let me just say, for any parent who has had to face anything like this, I've never talked to any of them who didn't also deal with the idea of, what does it mean, especially fathers, what does it mean that I wasn't able to protect my child? And being able to get to a place where they feel like a good enough person again, while they sort of grapple with that, is a real milestone, because there can be a lot of guilt anytime any positive feeling comes up. It triggers, oh yeah, but remember, and that's a real struggle. And so it takes work to sort of cultivate that and reconnect with those capacities once again, because there's some assumptions that have just been shattered. And those assumptions can be things like, yeah, well, parents should protect their children, or, good things happen to kids who work hard and people who work hard, but, my loved one didn't do anything to deserve what they got. Those assumptions get shattered. And then we've got to figure out how we build new ones that are actually going to be more helpful as we move forward.
Right.
So, developing the coping skills, I can never leave out, you have to take care of yourself physically because you are embodied. And if the body suffers, then there's no way that you can also then move through this process. So making sure you get that breathing in there, because breathing is one way to sort of bring down some of those emotions when they really get high. And breathing is not always going to do it. You've got to get more active sometimes depending on what's going on. But physical self-care, how you sleep, how you exercise, that's going to keep your body sort of in a zone where now you can take this on in a more constructive way, because the body is absolutely involved in this process.
Absolutely.
The social support, I would just say for social support, even for those of us who feel like we want to pull away under times of grief and stress and pain, people that you have people in your life. You got two sets of people, I would say. You got people who know how to be responsive and come alongside, and you experience them as helpful. And then you got people who come alongside and just drain the life out of you. And you just need to know both, okay? Because the ones who come alongside in a helpful way intentionally stay connected there. Intentionally, you're going to want to pull away at times. But that isolation can be devastating. And so you might need your solitary time, but never isolate. And it's really important that those people who are the good folks can read that, come alongside. And even if they just sit there, that's fine. But, when it comes time to visit the gravesite, take somebody with you. These are the times where the good folks in your life you want to actually intentionally stay connected to.
Absolutely. Dr. Williamson, I just want to say, for the sake of time, we're at 2:53, so we have 7 minutes left.
Okay.
I thank you for just going through not only the trauma, but how we can support one another and how we can support ourselves with the coping skills, whether it be by yourself or with others with the social support. And then the meaning and spirituality, I definitely want to cover that, and then we're going to move on.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'll hit that meaning in spirituality, and then we can move forward.
Yeah, within the next 2 minutes. Yes,
absolutely. Sir. Okay, so meaning in spirituality, you know, and now I'm speaking from my experience here in terms of the, you know, just my opportunity to sit with people in really difficult contexts. That meaning and purpose and spirituality piece, that is the frame that when you are truly dealing with the worst of the worst, that's so important. If you've got something that is truly meaningful, whether that be faith, spirituality, please stay connected to it. If it's important and you disconnect from it, that is a part of the stressor and the strain. But it is so important to figure out how we can reconnect with the things that make life worth living. And, you know, I can just put my cards on the table with this, just in closing in this way, you know, so I'm a therapist, but I'm also a therapist who believes in God, you know, and so what I have found is that, hey, you know, when we are going through our worst and when we are truly facing life's horrendous things, it is so important. I see where the comfort truly comes from when it comes to the faith and the spirituality. And it's not just that, hey, we you know, connect with a God who somehow has identified with us. It's not just identified with us. It's the fact that, hey, if you serve a God who got up from the grave, okay, and so that he might have faced death too, but as a result of that, he got up, and there's life in that. And by those stripes, you know, there's healing in that.
Absolutely.
Death doesn't define you. Death is not the ending, and it's been robbed of its finality. That is so important. Now, that's on the spiritual frame, and how we engage that then is so important. And so I would just say what I've seen in my experience then is that spiritual frame, stay connected, figure out how you can reconnect if it comes apart, because that is the thing that truly gets you through the darkest times.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that and for reassuring us in our faith that it's not the end. Death is not the end. We have something else in store for us. That is much appreciated. Thank you, Dr. Williamson.
Absolutely.
So as we move on to the relaxation techniques, we talked about breathing, we talked about lifestyle management, we talked about the difference between utilizing medication for the good and then self-medicating to kind of numb ourselves. So knowing the difference between the two, having those social supports, especially during times like this. So we're not able to physically connect, but having them on speed dial and being able to reach out if necessary. And the last thing we have in the next 4 minutes, I know some people were asking about resources. So this PowerPoint will go out to everyone and you guys can utilize these resources. There was one question that was sent out and I did not ask it, so I'm going to ask it now. One of the listeners on the Zoom call says, I've been a victim of rape, suffered through years of spousal abuse, and how my only son murdered, just living my life is a constant trigger. I think my way of coping is working excessively. The killing, the slaughter of Black Americans is just overwhelming. I feel the best way to deal with emotions to become active. What are your thoughts? She then goes on to say, I have not had good experiences with therapy. When I went after being late, I had a Caucasian therapist who insisted that I should be angry when at the time all I felt was hurt. Then, after my son was murdered, I went to an African-American male therapist who sexually harassed me, and I suffered through trauma of reporting him and all the red tape associated with that. So I would like to know how to find a therapist or a group that is a good match. Would any of the panelists like to chime in?
I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, like I said, it does take a little bit of research to find what you need. And also times when you know people that have gone through similar situations and have been open, like I have been, and like Dr. Najuma and others have spoke about, like, you know, having and receiving help, or, you know, getting therapy themselves. So you can sometimes go to who may spiritually advise you They might have a referral, or like I said, people in the same situations. But what I wanted to answer also the question of the lady is that the being active part. I think that takes time for you to get there, because it did for me, as my son also was murdered. It takes time to get there. And it's like a building process, process of building yourself up to it, because something like that can't happen and something so great be taken from you and you just bam go into like, oh yeah, I can, aid and, be an advocate and help others. No, what you have to do is go through your processes, of course, and find out your place in that. And for me, like I said, it was something that had been with me the whole time. Like my son always had friends that I was always helping, or he would always bring them home, like, basically, tell my mom she could fix it, but it was never just like that, but it always felt like that. But as I look into what I'm doing now and what I want to, take to the highest scale of what I'm doing, I've been doing it all the time. So it's time for you to, it's gives you a moment to sit back and reflect and realize what's been going on in your surroundings too. Sometimes, what you can be doing as an advocate is sometimes right in your face, and like Dr. Najuma was saying, when you express yourself sometimes over social media, things come about from stuff like that. Like I never realized how much people was just like, oh my God, like your strength, this and that, where I would feel totally broken in the inside, but they're looking at me like I'm, like a pillar of strength because I'm moving and I'm, still doing what I need to do and moving forward. But what I had to do my own self, and someone can tell you that all day until you realize, like I said to myself one day, like, I totally want to turn all of this pain into some sort of power. So it's all on what you really have to take time and have some time to yourself. And like I said, reflect on some things. And sometimes what you need to be doing as an advocate is right there in your face.
Absolutely. Dr. Najuma, we are out of time, but I want to give you the opportunity to
respond. I just
Yes,
want
ma'am.
to just offer to our sister that, number one, thank you for your bravery to share that out loud, but also what's compounded is not just the abuse, but now trust issues. And so that's a huge deal, because part of the healing is being in a trusted space, trusted community, trusted family, trusted friends. And so I just want to offer to you that that to look for places and people that you feel you can trust before trying to fix anything. Because if you don't trust the process, if you don't trust the space, even if someone gave you resources, that has to come from a trusted space. So I just want to offer that to you as lean into people and spaces, Julie, that you feel you can trust, and start there, and then work because now there's a compounded issue of trauma and trust, and we got to get you to a trusted space. And you and I've already chatted, but and that's for anybody. Get to a trusted space, whether it's an individual or a group or an agency. And sometimes a trusted space is outside of the circle that we're familiar with, but get to a trusted space quickly.
Absolutely. So for the sake of time, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I would like for the guest speakers to share their information, since we don't have it on a slide to share, because this conversation is being recorded, they can refer back. But I thank you all so much for allowing us to have this conversation. Thank you, Ms. Candy, for allowing me to have the platform to do it. And I thank you for your support. I thank PRC for their support. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Najuma first. Give your information. If you are willing to be contacted, let us know how we can do that.
Yes, I'm Reverend Najuma Smith-Pollard, and on Facebook, I'm going to put it in the chat, but on Facebook and Instagram, you can find me at Rev Juju. So if you put that on Facebook, Instagram, you can find me there. And then you can also reach me at my church, and I'm putting that number there.
Awesome.
And so either way, and then you can email me.
Awesome.
I'm
Thank
putting
you
it
so
there.
much.
But yeah, just hit me up, and I am available for contact. And we do have some people that we're connected with, so we can definitely connect you if possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Mustafa, Jabril, would you like to give closing information about how we can reach you?
Yes, hi. I can be reached on Facebook, Mustafa Jabril. You can find it on Facebook. I'm going to also type it in, but as well as I'm going to type in my phone number so that way I can be reached by phone, and I will answer immediately.
And I just want to say he's very good with responding back, y'all. So if you call him and he doesn't answer, he will give you a call back. Miss April Dean,
Yes.
do you have any information you'd like to share as far as contact information or resources that you have that you'd like to share?
Oh yeah, I can also be reached on Facebook. April Dean is on Facebook, and also on Instagram. I'm adean365, and I'll put in my number too also, and I can be reached immediately.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Rick Williamson.
Absolutely. So I just put in the chat box the website for me and my group, Amada Psychology Center. So please find me there. And I've got 8 other wonderful therapists, and we represent the spectrum in terms of diversity. We have Spanish speakers, we've got South Asian therapists. So we are intentional about connecting with our communities of color. So give us a call.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your schedule to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, guest speakers, for your willingness to participate. And we hope that you all gain something out of this conversation. And once again, if you are interested or if you need someone to speak to after this conversation, please reach out to info@prc123 and send us an email, and we'll be more than happy to respond. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys have an awesome day.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Blessing.
You too.
Yes,
Thank
bless
you.
No, I'm done.
Thanks, Jennifer. Take care.